We're going to dismiss the children to Children's Church now. And so if you are one of our Children's Church volunteers this week, please stand up so that the children can make their way over to you now. I'm going to give you just a moment to do that while I grab the water bottle I forgot at my pew. Okay. It is the fourth Sunday of the month, and you know what that means. This morning we are having this month's Ask Me Anything service. If we have any first-time visitors this morning or anybody who just came in off the street not knowing what this morning was, we are super glad that you were here and you came for a very unusual service. What is happening this morning is this. We have all got questions about God, about the Bible, about Christianity that we've always wished someone would explain to us, right? We have all got those lingering questions that we wish someone could answer for us, but that no one has taken the time to help walk us through, right? Well, every Sunday, or every fourth Sunday, we devote our entire service to tackling those exact questions. All month long, we have a box set up in the foyer in front of the church, and we have a QR code that comes up on the screen that you can send your questions into, and you can ask those questions that have always confused or challenged you. And then on the fourth Sunday of the month, we count up those questions that have been sent in. We take whichever questions you guys have submitted to us more often than any other question, and we spend the whole service diving deep into answering that question. And this month, we've got a good one. This month, we've got a weird one, which is awesome because, you know, I love weird questions. By this point, you know that, right? But it's one of the things I love about the Ask Me Anything series is that I end up preaching on things. It would literally never have occurred to me to preach on, right? I end up teaching about things it would never have occurred to me to teach about. That it would literally just never have popped into my head to spend any time tackling, and this week is one of those. It was really funny because I was all set thinking we were going to tackle a totally different question. And then over the course of this month, I sat down and counted up all the questions, and I found that there was a new question that you guys have asked more than any other question by about 1 million miles. And it's a question that is really relevant right now. It's a question about Halloween. Can you guess what the question's going to be? Of course you can. You sent it in, right? The question that we've received more than any other question over the past month has been this. Is Halloween secretly pagan or occult? Now, this is not exactly a new question, actually. I misspoke because we've been getting this question since the very beginning of our Ask Me Anything series. This is one of the first questions we ever got, but it started flooding in over the past few weeks. We've gotten a few versions of it, right? Should Christians celebrate Halloween? That was one. Is Halloween secretly a cult? Does Halloween the worship of demons? That one was really intensely worded. Is Halloween a pagan ritual? Does Halloween worship pagan gods? And so on and so forth. This is a question that seems to have been on everybody's mind, which doesn't surprise me at all because every year around September, right, when spooky season kind of kicks off, what happens? Suddenly social media gets flooded by Christian TikTokers saying exactly that, right? Suddenly your Facebook reels get absolutely bombarded with Christian influencers saying Halloween is pagan, right? When we were promoting our trunk or treat event that happened last week, we got flooded with Facebook comments and messages to the church's account yelling at us for participating in Halloween activities. You might have seen some of those. You might have screenshotted them because they were funny. One woman messaged me personally to tell me that I was a servant of Satan because I was letting my church perform secret pagan rituals. She didn't even send it to the church's account. She somehow found my personal Facebook account and sent me a message request to tell me that I was a false teacher for having a trunk or treat. I was like, you put a lot of work into this. I respect it, honestly. But that's how my week went. And it's easy to laugh at people like that. But that's a common view among a lot of Christians, including a lot of really smart Christians, right? That is a common view among a lot of Christians, including a lot of really wise Christians, including a lot of Christians that I deeply respect. And so as a result, you may have grown up hearing from your pastor or preacher or someone else that Halloween was off limits to Christians. You may have grown up hearing that Halloween is in some way opposed or antithetical to the Christian faith. You may have grown up hearing that worshiping Jesus and celebrating Halloween are somehow contradictory to each other. That is a claim that you hear not just about Halloween, but about a lot of popular holidays, right? Know what I'm talking about? There are people out there who claim that holidays like Easter and Christmas, that's like the Christian Super Bowl, are secretly pagan rituals that Christians should not celebrate, right? A lot of pastors and preachers and teachers claim that Easter was originally a pagan fertility festival. Have you ever heard that one before? A lot of them say that Easter was originally a pagan festival in honor of a goddess named Ishtar, and that Christians just haphazardly turned it into a holiday celebrating the resurrection. Some days or some years when I'm really overwhelmed around Easter time, I think about taking up that belief just so I can get out of having to do it, right? But as a result, there's a lot of hardcore fundamentalist churches that refuse to celebrate Easter. In the same way, a lot of pastors and preachers and teachers claim that Christmas was originally the pagan festival of Saturnalia. And as a result, they refuse to celebrate Christmas. That's what Jehovah's Witnesses and some other groups like that believe. But there is no holiday that stirs up more wrath among Christians than Halloween. If you've never heard any of this before, I'm going to lay it all out as clearly and simply as I can. A whole lot of pastors and preachers and teachers claim that Halloween was originally a Celtic, Druid, pagan festival called Samhain. That's how you pronounce that word right there. It's not Samhain, it's pronounced Samhain. But they claim that during Samhain, Celtic priests gained the power to predict the future. They claim that during Samhain, fairies and spirits would break into our world and wreak mischief. They claimed that during Samhain, sacrifices were performed to appease the Celtic deities, typically human sacrifices, typically the sacrifice of children. They claimed that during Samhain, the Celts would wear animal skin costumes to scare away the spirits, and that they would place jack-o'-lanterns in front of their homes to keep the spirits from entering. And they claimed that when we celebrate Halloween, we are accidentally worshiping pagan gods and opening a door for pagan spirits to enter our lives. Just out of curiosity, has anyone ever heard some version of that before? Of course you have. That's why you wrote it down and put it in the question box, right? And so for many of us, there's a good chance that that is what you grew up hearing when you heard about Halloween. And as a result, you were left wondering today, should we celebrate this holiday at all? And that's a good question. If those things are true, then it's reasonable to ask the question, should we celebrate Halloween at all? So, we want to spend this morning answering that question. Is Halloween secretly pagan? Is Halloween secretly occult? And I'm going to give you the long answer in just a moment. But before we get there, I'm going to give you the short answer, just so you know where we're going with all of this. Are you ready for the short answer? Okay, here it is. No. No, Halloween is not secretly a pagan ritual. It is not secretly a pagan festival. It is not secretly a pagan practice. And you have not been accidentally worshiping pagan gods. Give me a little bit. I'll explain why I say that. We're going to dive deep into why none of those things are true over the next 20 or 30 minutes. Sound good? Okay, let's go. I'm just going to dive straight in and start with number one. I'm going to start with probably the most important aspect of our answer. Number one, the so-called pagan roots of Halloween were invented by a con man from the 1800s. I'm going to say that again. The so-called pagan roots of Halloween were invented by a con man from the 1800s. Out of curiosity, anybody know where I'm going with this one? Okay, this is going to be good then. So, what am I talking about when I say that? Here's what I'm talking about. All of those claims that we just listed off, all of those claims that the Christian TikTokers put out there, all those claims that are popping up on your Facebook Reels, all of those claims that your aunt is sharing on her Facebook page, they all come from exactly one book. They don't come from a bunch of historians. They don't come from a bunch of professionals who spent years researching ancient pagan culture. They come from one book written by one dude in the 1800s. The source for all of these claims about Halloween's supposed pagan origins come from a book written in 1890 by a Scottish author named James George Fraser. The book is called The Golden Bow. Has anybody heard of The Golden Bow by James George Fraser? There's a reason you haven't heard of it. Just to give you an idea of how historically reliable The Golden Bow is, in that book, the author James Fraser claims that Jesus is a fictional character invented by Christians. He claims that everything about Jesus was ripped off from earlier stories about pagan gods like the Egyptian god Horus and Ra, as well as the pagan god Mithras and the Zoroastrian religion. If you've ever heard that claim before, like an internet atheist, that claim was invented by James Fraser. James Fraser says that the entire story that the Bible tells is a myth ripped off from other pagan religions, and that the earliest Christians were a death cult who drank human blood. So, just to be clear, this is the guy who wrote the book that invented the claim that Halloween was pagan. Now, at the time, his book, The Golden Bow, was extremely influential. The Golden Bow inspired a whole bunch of other copycat books, and thousands of authors who came after him took the claims he made in The Golden Bow, didn't bother confirming or researching any of them, and repeated them, and repeated them, and repeated them like a game of telephone. And so to this day, in fields like anthropology and comparative religion, there are still claims floating around that were literally made up out of whole cloth by this con man named James Fraser. But something really funny has happened over the past 140 years since he wrote that book. What's happened is that nearly every word of his book has been debunked and disproven. His book has been thoroughly myth-busted. It's actually kind of funny looking back. The British anthropologist Robert Ackerman called The Golden Bow an embarrassment. Another expert named Godfrey Leonhardt wrote that Fraser's claims seem to have originated almost entirely in his imagination. That is not something you want people to say about your nonfiction book, right? The expert Edmund Leach wrote that whenever the evidence didn't fit Fraser's story, He simply altered the evidence. And the celebrated anthropologist Rene Girard called the golden bow a grave injustice to the field of ethnology. In other words, we can't trust the book or the man that all these claims about the pagan origins of Halloween came from, because he was an infamous, pathological liar who made his money conning people. That is the first thing we have to understand as we think through this question. The pagan roots of Halloween were invented by a con man from the 1800s. That's number one. And here's number two. It makes no sense to say that Halloween is rooted in Celtic paganism, because we have almost no reliable information about ancient Celtic paganism. I'm going to say that again. We have almost no reliable information about ancient Celtic paganism. I know we're getting really deep into history lesson territory here, but bear with me, please. I promise, it'll be worth it. So many horror movies and TV shows and stuff like that involve evil druid priests doing evil pagan sorcery and stuff like that. Know what I'm talking about? Ever flip through the channels somewhere near Halloween and a horror movie was on and you watched 5 minutes of it and you screamed and regretted it? Yeah, some of my favorite movies are horror movies about people who get attacked by evil Celtic, druid, pagans. Anybody ever seen that movie, The Wicker Man? All right. I love the movie The Wicker Man. It's full of it, right? It's about druidic pagans. Ever seen any of the later Halloween movies where they start to get all weird, right? Where Michael Myers has this tattoo of a thorn and he has to kill his family because the Celtic druids are forcing him to do it. It's all about Celtic and druid pagans. The list goes on. They make great horror movie villains, but they didn't actually exist. As far as we know, those Celtic, druid, pagans who did human sacrifices and conjured up evil gods from under the ground and all that stuff, as far as we know, it didn't actually exist. Because we know practically nothing about ancient Celtic culture. We know almost nothing about the ancient druids. Almost none of the things that you've seen in horror movies and TikToks and conspiracy theory websites about Celtic druids and stuff like that are actually true. Almost all of it is made up, because before the coming of Christianity, the Celtic peoples didn't write anything down to preserve their history. We have absolutely no written record that tells us anything about all those scattered Celtic peoples who existed before the coming of Christianity. So, just to be clear, Christianity came to the Celtic regions in about the 500 or 600 mark, somewhere around there. We don't have any writings whatsoever about ancient Celtic paganism until the 1600s, which means there's 1,000 years separating the coming of Christianity and any writings whatsoever about ancient Celtic pagans. So everything that was written about them in the 1600s onward, they're not getting it from old records. It just came from some people's imaginations. And as a result, we don't actually know anything about them except for where they lived. And so I love the way that one scholar named Carolyn Emmerich puts it. She says, when we claim that Halloween is rooted in ancient paganism, we arrive at this conclusion not by hard evidence, like a written record, because the inhabitants of Britain didn't record things in writing during the pre-Christian era. We simply assume the pagan origins of folk customs like the jack-o'-lantern. I say we don't have any evidence for this. We're just assuming. Now, real quick, if I came up to you and said, hey, you know that guy over there? he's killed 17 people. You said, whoa, how do you know? I said, oh, I'm just assuming. How reliable is that? It's not. It makes absolutely no sense to say that Halloween is rooted in ancient Celtic paganism, because we don't know anything at all about ancient Celtic paganism. And that brings us to number 3. And that is that we don't actually know anything about what Samhain actually was. It makes no sense to say that Halloween is rooted in some ancient pagan ritual called Samhain, because we don't actually know anything about what Samhain even was. As far as we know, everything James Fraser wrote about Samhain in The Golden Bow was completely made up, because he didn't have access to any historical records to go by. We have exactly one reference to Samhain in all of ancient history, and it is literally just a calendar from the 1st century BC. It's literally just a notch on this bronze calendar, and on that notch it says Samhain. Now, this is important. It doesn't say what Samhain is. It doesn't say what happens during Samhain. It doesn't say what Samhain is for. The only thing we know about Samhain from this calendar is that it probably represented the transition between summer and winter, and that's just because Samos, that's the root word that Samhain comes from, meant summer. We have absolutely no reliable evidence that it had anything to do with ghosts or witches or jack-o'-lanterns or religious ceremonies of any kind. As far as we actually know, it was just a standard ancient festival celebrating the beginning of winter. But here's the thing, we don't actually even know it was a festival. We're just guessing. It's like if you went to somebody's house, right? You went to a house that hadn't been inhabited for 100 years, and you found an old 100-year-old calendar, and on it, there was something that said, Rick. What do you know about Rick? Maybe it's a person, right? But if you went home and you said, man, I found this 100-year-old calendar, and on there, I found evidence that there was an ancient festival called Rick, where they sacrificed children and made ghosts come out of the woodwork. What are you doing? You're making stuff up, right? It makes no sense to say that Halloween is rooted in some pagan festival called Samhain, because we know practically nothing about what Samhain even was. And what all of this means is that there is absolutely no real evidence linking Halloween with ancient paganism. Which leads us to ask a very different question. What is Halloween then? Where did Halloween actually come from? If it's not a secret pagan holiday, what is it? Just like before, I'm going to give you the long answer, but first I'm going to give you the short answer. Are you ready? Here it comes. It's an old church festival. You may have a hard time wrapping your head around this, but the actual origin of Halloween is that it's an old church festival, and it always has been. Just to be clear, spoiler alert, Christians didn't steal Halloween from the pagans. Pagans stole Halloween from the Christians. Let me explain what I'm talking about. I'm going to start back over with 1. Are you ready? Here we go. The earliest version of Halloween was a set of 4th century church festivals called Martyrs' Day and All Saints' Day. Ever heard of these before? The earliest version of Halloween was a set of 4th century church festivals called Martyrs' Day and All Saints' Day. Let's talk about those. What was Martyrs' Day? Martyrs' Day was a festival created by the early church where they would take a day to remember the Christians who were martyred by the Roman government. It was very similar to what we are doing nowadays when we celebrate Memorial Day. What do we do on Memorial Day? We take a day to consciously, purposefully remember those who have fallen in battle, right? In the same way, the early church would take a day called Martyrs' Day to remember their brothers and sisters in the faith who'd been martyred by the Roman government that was persecuting them. Now, the churches in some regions would celebrate Martyrs' Day near the end of April, but churches in other regions would celebrate Martyrs' Day in late October or early November, just as fall started to come on in full force. Now, around that same time, there was another festival that they started to celebrate. That was a very similar tradition called All Saints' Day. What was All Saints' Day? It was a church festival where they would remember not only Christians who were martyred, but all of their Christian ancestors who had passed away. All of the saints. They would take a day where they consciously remembered and honored their deceased loved ones in the faith. And once again, some churches celebrated All Saints' Day in the middle of the spring, typically in May. Other churches celebrated All Saints' Day at other parts of the year. But during the early centuries of the church, it wasn't fully united and organized, so it took a while before they all got on the same page. And what happened was that these two festivals were eventually combined into one festival called All Hallows. Ever heard that term before? If you go to like a high liturgical church, they probably still refer to this time of year as Hallowtide or All Hallows. These two festivals were combined into one festival called All Hallows, and essentially what happened was that as the early church became more organized, they decided they needed to pick one date that all the churches could celebrate Martyrs' Day and All Saints' Day on together. It'd be kind of like, imagine if every church had a slightly different day that they celebrated Christmas. That'd be kind of a bummer, right? Wouldn't it be better if we just picked a day and we all celebrated it then, right? My friend Gunnar is Eastern Orthodox, and he has a different date for Christmas and a different date for Easter than me, so I make fun of him. I'm like, hey, just join the rest of us, right? But they ultimately decided that they would formally put all these celebrations on one day together in late fall. They would celebrate it just as fall began to turn into winter at the end of October or the beginning of November. Why do you think they chose the fall date? It's because fall reminds us of death. That's why. They chose this late fall date, October 31st and November 1st, because as the trees start to die, and the greenery starts to die, and the animals prepare to hibernate, and the crops start to go dormant, the date fits perfectly with the theme of remembering and honoring our dead loved ones and martyrs. So the origin of Halloween is this church festival called All Hallows. Halloween is literally just a juxtaposition of All Hallows Eve in the dialect of those British Christians. Now, what does a festival that honors martyrs and deceased Christians have to do with Halloween as we practice it today? Everything. Here's why. During All Hallows Eve, they celebrated Christ's victory over death and hell with costumes and dancing. During Hallows Eve, they celebrated Christ's victory over death with costumes and dancing. I was talking to somebody about this one time, and they said, well, that doesn't sound very Christian. And I was like, yes, it does. The early Christians were just less boring than you. Where do Halloween costumes come from? They come from the Christians who invented All Hallows Eve. What happened was that they invented this very strange tradition called the dance macabre. Ever heard the term dance macabre before? There's a bunch of metal songs called dance macabre. It's named after this. I don't know if they know that, but it's named after this. But what happened was that on All Hallows Eve, they would stitch together costumes that were made to look like skeletons and other scary stuff. They stitched together costumes that were supposed to remind them of death. Modern Westerners are allergic to thinking about death, right? We want to trick ourselves into thinking we're going to live forever until we turn about 80 or 90, and then we just want to die in our sleep, right? That is not how it was with the ancient Christians. Oh man, I thought that was funnier than I expected. I can never guess which jokes are going to land. But they had this saying in the ancient Christian world, memento mori. Ever heard that one? You might have that like tattooed on your lower back or something like that. Let me tell you what it means. I'm going to explain your tattoo to you. All right? It means always remember death. So, if you didn't know, your lower back tattoo is awesome. All right? It's metal as heck. But always remember death. They wanted to keep the reality that they were going to die one day constantly on their mind so that they would live for the Lord instead of wasting their life on worldly things. And one of the ways that they did that was by putting on scary costumes that reminded them of death and then dancing. Why would they dance? Because the dancing was a reminder that even though death is inevitable, Christ has defeated death. They put on scary costumes and danced to remind themselves that death has lost its sting and the forces of darkness have been defeated, and they called that the dance macabre. It's a way to remember that death is coming, but there is hope beyond death. And so every year, just as fall was transitioning into winter and everything around them was dying, they would celebrate All Hallows Eve by putting on scary costumes and dancing to remind themselves of Christ's victory over death as they honored the martyrs and their deceased Christian loved ones. It's starting to come into view. We are still not done, though, because at exactly the same time, they had another tradition. Because during that All Hallows Eve celebration, the children would go out throughout the village. There were no helicopter parents back then. So the kids would wander the village at will, and they would knock on people's doors and sing songs in exchange for home-baked sweets. Processed candy didn't exist back then, so you would bake some sweets in your house and you'd give it to the kids who knocked on your door. They called that guising. The kids would put on their scary All Hallows Eve costumes and go beg for sweets at your doorstep. Does that sound familiar? We have a new name for it now. Where did trick-or-treating come from? It came from the Christians who invented Halloween. And so, just to be clear, Halloween originated as a church festival where they would remember and honor the dead, put on scary costumes and dance, and send the kids out to go knock on people's doors begging for sweets. That is the story of Halloween. Christians didn't steal Halloween from the pagans. Pagans stole Halloween from the Christians. So, to answer the question, is Halloween secretly pagan? The answer is no. It's actually exactly the opposite. And so you don't have to ban Halloween in your household. You can. It's fine. You don't have to celebrate anything you don't want to, right? But you shouldn't ban it on false pretenses. Halloween is not a pagan holiday that's been copied by Christians. It's a Christian holiday that was invented by Christians as a way of celebrating some of the most glorious truths of our Christian faith. And so, if anything, the takeaway from all of this should be that rather than banning or avoiding Halloween, we should be reclaiming Halloween. You know, there's all this talk about reclaiming the true meaning of Christmas, and that's good. We need to reclaim the true meaning of Halloween. Because it's not just about going and getting candy. It's not just about watching scary movies. It's not just about putting on costumes and carving up a pumpkin, even though all those things are good. Halloween is about celebrating the gloriously good news that Christ has defeated death and hell. Christ has overcome the forces of darkness. Christ has curb stomped the devil. He has crushed the demons. He has defeated the pagan gods that used to wreak havoc on this world. And so we have a glorious hope beyond death. And we are going to see our deceased loved ones in the Lord again. And even as we mourn the loss of so many people that we care about, we have a profound joy in the knowledge that they are going to be returned to us when we are reunited with the Lord one day. And I think that is a holiday worth celebrating. That is the only question that we're going to have time to tackle this morning. And so we're going to have to hang it up until next month in our November Ask Me Anything service. But between now and then, don't stop asking questions. Keep asking hard questions. Keep holding your difficulties and your confusions and your doubts and your uncertainties to the light of God's Word so that we can work through them together. And so we've put up a QR code on the screen that you can scan and send in even more of your most difficult questions about God and the Bible and Christianity. And I cannot wait to work through them together with you next month. And so as we close out our time this morning and get ready to head to our discussion groups, I just want to close out, like always, by praying for you. If you would bow your head and close your eyes. Let's pray. Father, we have a glorious hope because you have defeated death through the sacrifice of Jesus. You have overcome the grave through the blood of Jesus Christ. So now, no matter how horrible it is to lose people, we have the glorious hope that we are going to get them back when you raise us up together one day. No matter how horrifying the prospect of our eventual death is, we have the great hope that our death is going to be undone when you raise us up one day. And because that is true, where the horrible realities of the world try to force us into mourning, you invite us into dancing. We can laugh at death. We can mock death because you have taken away its sting. And because that is true, we offer you our humble and amazed worship this morning. So now be glorified in our joyful worship together. And all of God's people said, amen. If you would now stand as we respond in worship through song.